So with less than 2 hours to spare before a midnight deadline, negotiators have signed on to a rewritten North American Free Trade Agreement. Canada agreed to the new NAFTA deal, preserving the trade pact between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. Sources say the final stumbling blocks were worked out.
The U.S. will have greater access to Canada's dairy market, and the threatened U.S. tariffs on Canadian auto exports have been addressed. The leaders of all three countries are expected to sign the new treaty. After that, the U.S. Congress has 60 days to review and approve it.
CNN's Paula Newton is following these developments and joins us now on the phone from New York. Paula, so it looks like NAFTA is in the end going to survive the Trump presidency.
Yeah, it's going to survive in a way, shape, or form, but not the acronym. They will be calling this the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. Donald Trump wanted a branding change, and he got it. And in many ways, Cyril, in terms of what substantively has gone on here, definitely the Trump administration is saying that, look, we have been able to negotiate a much more level playing field when it comes to things like automobiles. And obviously, as Donald Trump has been saying in many rallies in the last few weeks, they wanted access to that all-important Canadian dairy market. So important to U.S. farmers, but what's to be understood here is that it's very important to American politicians who want to make sure that they can tout this deal as being better for U.S. farmers. Canada came away with a lot as well, though, completely intact, word for word, from the old agreement is something called Chapter 19. What does that mean? It means that Canada can go to an independent referee when it has a dispute, a trading dispute with the United States, and does not have to subject itself to any kind of U.S. ruling. That remains intact from the old deal. All in all, it is not a wholesale change of the agreement that was already on the table, but enough, administration officials say, for Donald Trump to claim that he's basically had another victory on yet another campaign promise.
So, and you referred to this, Donald Trump during his entire campaign said NAFTA was one of the worst deals the U.S. has ever signed. It was terrible for the United States. Essentially, what the U.S. gets out of 1 year of renegotiation is access to the Canadian dairy market. This is the big win?
Exactly, and it has to be said that whatever they are getting closely mirrors what Europe and the Pacific trading partners through what was called the TPP have already negotiated, something that Canada was already willing to do and are preparing its dairy industry, saying, yes, we have to do this, we have to open up our markets. Having said that, on automobiles, something that Donald Trump also had said during the campaign was very important to him, it is about that level playing field to make sure that U.S. workers are not undercut in their own backyard and that their jobs will not go principally to Mexico. It didn't really seem that Canada was much of a threat in that way. But no, I mean, you clocked that right there, Cyril. This is a win, really, for Canada in that regard in terms of what they got out of the deal. And certainly Canadian officials are characterizing it that way.
Okay, and also the name change. You told us it's not called NAFTA anymore. USMC, United States, Mexico, Canada. That's the new name. CNN's Paula Newton in New York. Thank you very much. We'll keep hearing from you, I'm sure. Thanks.
And for more on the deal, we're joined by Jeffrey Rosenzweig. He's a professor at Emory University's Business School in Atlanta. Thank you for coming in.
My pleasure.
So why is this so important? We did hear a senior administration official say this is a big win for U.S., Canada, and Mexico.
It's only a big win in that it avoided a silly disaster. There's a lot of benefits from NAFTA, including for U.S. workers and very much for U.S. consumers. And to throw it away for no real reason other than some political game would have been a shame. You know, if the win is that we got a little more access for our dairy farmers are, you know, they're nice people, but they're like one out of every 10,000 workers in the U.S. I think President Trump needed a political win going into the midterm elections. He can point to his tax package. He wanted to point to something else, but there's nothing there. If that's a win, it's the shallowest win I've ever seen.
Well, did it make sense for President Trump to try and renegotiate NAFTA? It has been around for many, many years.
And that's the interesting thing. It made sense because it's been around for a quarter century. And 25 years ago, when they negotiated NAFTA, they weren't thinking about things like e-commerce. So it really would have made sense to go in and think about e-commerce and how that is going to affect things and some of the technological advances. But to swing it back to what really is just dairy, there was a lot of noise about autos and then aluminum and steel. And as we heard about independent dispute mechanisms, all that actually went nowhere. So the only real rationale, which is to catch up with the technological advancements in the last 25 years, was ignored.
Well, in pushing for a redo, the president risked damaging relations with a very close ally in America's largest export market. Not to mention, Canada's one of the nicest nations on the planet. But now there's a deal. So can President Trump, even though you say maybe the change was light, can he claim a savvy business move?
I think it was such a minor business move. And when you look at the totality, but as you say, we're in a world of some great geopolitical risk, and business people know that. That's one reason business people like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce very much against us fighting with Canada at this point. You know, a part of business is to get along with allies. Canada is our closest ally, and Canada and Mexico, by a large margin, are the biggest market for our exports. And our export jobs are often high paid. We buy more from China than we do from any nation, but we sell much more to Canada and Mexico than to a whole plethora of nations combined.
Well, I want to ask you, you mentioned China. Is the rationale for a potential trade war with China very different for that used by this administration, by President Trump, to demand a NAFTA reboot?
Yes, when President Trump was saying some very unkind and untrue things about Prime Minister Trudeau this summer, he would complain that Canada was ripping us off. They had a trade surplus with us, and therefore they were taking our money. When in fact, if you include goods and services, because a lot of international trade these days are services like communication services and education and tourism. Well, if you take goods and services, we actually have a surplus with Canada, so there was no rationale. With China, we have a trade deficit that's approaching $400 billion, $1 billion a day. Now, you don't have to balance trade with every nation. Maybe a nation has something you need, and then another nation has something that you have. But $1 billion a day does seem extreme. It does seem that China is not playing on a level playing field. Also, there's a lot of evidence that they are stealing our intellectual property. When our firms want to invest there, they force us to do it in a joint venture and to hand over some of the technology. How we go about it, I don't think we've gone about it the right way. You don't put the Chinese in a position of losing face. I think we could go about it more diplomatically, but that's where the trade deficit is. Canada and Mexico are our markets and our allies.
All right, well, NAFTA is wrapped up, it seemed, at least for the president's concern, and now the focus will be on the next deal with China. Thanks so much for coming in, Dr. Jeff Rosenzweig. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Natalie.